To moderate this panel. The panel is titled, Where Have We Come in 50 Years? Examining the Political Environment Through the Eyes of Fannie Payment. We actually have three panelists. Our third panel, the first one that's listed. You also let him sit there for a while, see if something broken or whatever, before you snatch him up. We have three panelists here. Okay, we have three panelists. The first person in your program on this session is on the way. He's actually been held up over in the Penguin having lunch, but he assured us that he's on the way. He got there in time enough to have lunch and be here, but he had to wait to be seated. So I will offer his apologies to you on his behalf. And that's Darrell Johnson, who is the state president of the NAACP. Darrell is also an attorney, and I know he is a consultant involved in redistricting and reapportionment plans as well. So when he comes in, he'll be the last panelist. Our first panelist is therefore the second person on your program, attorney Pam Shaw. And she is an attorney. I'm not sure why that is not on here, but Pam wears a number of different hats. She has been a major consultant, at least during the time I've known her, for the Children's Defense Fund. I do not know if she's still doing that now, but I know that in addition to that, Pam has done some very good work with a firm out of Washington, D.C., I think, involving some political surveys and some very interesting work that she's done there. I also know that she has worked in a consulting role with the Legislative Black Caucus. I had the good pleasure of being asked to be one of the persons to present at a caucus workshop in '05 in Vicksburg, and I know she's done some of those things since then. And so I'm very happy to see Pam. And some of us were treated already to Pam's capacity for recitation on any number of issues. She is also, in addition to those things I have noted, she runs an outfit called Pam Shaw and Associates here in Jackson. And our next person who's actually going to be our second panelist is Dr. Roy DeBerry, who is currently the director of the Hill Country Project in Ashland, Mississippi. And Derek has, I hope he doesn't have indigestion while he's sitting here, but he has gotten over here now. And so Darrell Johnson, attorney Darrell Johnson, will be our last panelist. And then we will open up for comments and questions and answers. And then at the very end, Dr. McLemore will make some comments to us. So thank you very much for attending this session. I will give you Attorney Pam Shaw.
All right.
Everybody had lunch?
Yeah.
But you got a little bit of energy walking over here, right?
Yeah.
How many of you were here this morning and came back this afternoon because I said come back? Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Let me begin by thanking Dr. McLemore for this invitation. I have been, in my language, sitting with this topic, this experience, being here with young people, this particular week, for a minute. And I've kind of had, I don't know if you've ever had just like all these things you want to say and you know you can't get them all in. That's how I felt about this, because there is an urgency in my spirit to share with you a message about not just looking back, but where we got to go forward.
All right.
So let me tell you the significance of this week for me. One, there are people who have been celebrating James Meredith's integration of, they told me don't say Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi. With all that went along with that. The good, the bad. And if you are anywhere in that 50s and you paid attention to what had happened this week on the news, you know that it wasn't a very pretty story here in Mississippi.
Right.
And there's something significant about that. And you also noted that Mr. Meredith had some trepidation about celebrating what he called, I'm a citizen and it ought to be my right. So why we ought to be celebrating my doing what ought to be my right? And I want y'all to put a pin in that, right? Because that's significant. The other thing that is significant for me this week is on tomorrow they're going to be unveiling the statue of Mrs. Hamer in Ruleville. Ruleville's in Bolivar County. It's in Sunflower County. Sunflower County is one of the counties that they are consolidating the schools in Mississippi. They're consolidating the schools in Mississippi in Sunflower County. The legislature made this decision because the schools have been labeled consistent and persistently underachieving and failing. So this is a woman who, from this community, her presence, her life, her dedication transformed this nation. And in her backyard, the schools are failing. We got to put a pin in that one. The other thing that had me just kind of really in an uproar the last 24 hours was the presidential debate last night. How many of y'all watched that? How many of you were disappointed? How many of you were disappointed because you thought the President Obama didn't fight enough? Well, you know, that is who he is, what he had to be in order for him to be president. Put a pin in that, because that is about the description of who our African American leaders are and what their temperament is. Okay? So, y'all put a pin in all those things. When I say put a pin in for the students, y'all need to write that down. Because it means that I'm going to come back to that at some point, and if I don't, that's a question you need to ask me in the end, okay? Because there is an urgency behind that. Again, as I said, I've been thinking about this week and thinking about Mrs. Hamer and thinking about what are the attributes of Mrs. Hamer that made her who she was. And somebody that, here it is today, we honor, we name an institute after. People want to read about it, want to learn more for, and she's absolutely something and somebody that we want to emulate. And the question becomes, are the people that we currently have in leadership in any way emulating that? Right? First of all, she was a woman of courage. A woman who was fearless. She was a warrior of biblical proportion. She was a woman who was not defined by the zip code of her geography.
That's right.
She grew up poor, in a poor community, but not defined by that. She walked boldly in her calling, and out of that calling created a career. Put a pin in that, young people, because one of the things is to talk about what it is we need to do as we move forward, and one of those is walking boldly in your calling and making that calling a career. She had a passion for life, but the prospect of dying did not immobilize her. Actually, the prospect of dying fanned the flame that encouraged and nurtured her engagement in the movement. She did this at a time and in a place where for many people, they didn't even have an indoor toilet. They ain't had no telephone. The TV was mostly the national news. If you had one, it was black and white. And the newspaper was controlled by those people who did not have your best interest at heart. And in many instances, so many of our folk were so undereducated they couldn't read. Now let's look at where we are today and what we have today. How many people in this room got a cell phone? Got internet on your cell phone? Got a Facebook account? Got Twitter? Watched TV on multiple channels, a cable channel last evening? How many of you grew up with an indoor toilet, with hot water, with a phone in your room and a TV? We take those things for granted. We take those things for granted. When we want to know what's going on with somebody, we look at their Facebook page. If you were people, there's a generation of young people that text and don't talk. And you know, I take umbrage because what? I'm over 50, and so I'm not always texting. I'm calling, and I have nieces and nephews and great nieces and nephews, and you know, my niece would text me, don't call me. I want to have a conversation. Now, I'm highlighting this for a reason. Imagine what Mrs. Hamer was able to get done with the resources she had. Now ask yourself, what are you able to get done with the resources you have?
Right now.
And that's the challenge we find with our current level of leadership. I tell the story, and Dr. McLemore, you're going to have to indulge me because it's one of my favorite stories to tell. I came of age, I'm a product of Vicksburg Public Schools. I experienced all of the iterations of integration. They did the first choice when I started the first grade. And my mother said, no, I'm not going to send my baby to school with them white people. Right? That's what she said. I went to the black elementary school, King Carl Elementary School, with my older brothers. My brothers are 6 and 4 years older than I am. So by the time I got to the third grade, they were no longer there. And I went to the school out of my neighborhood by myself. Then my mother decided, well, no, okay, I'll send her to the school that is 2 blocks from my house. Same street, 2 blocks away, which was a white elementary school. So I was one of 2 little black girls in the 4th grade class. Right? And in my 4th grade class, after my first 6 weeks, I got D's. So my mother said, what's going on? I said, I don't know. Right? Because I didn't know, right? Because you're in the 4th grade, you're 9 years old, what you know? So my mother was who she was. She came to the school and she sat in the back of the classroom for a week. And she didn't say anything. She just sat in the back of the classroom for a week. And at the end of the week, she said, go on outside, let me have a conversation with your teacher. But because I am who I am, I stood beside the door to see what she had to say. And she said to the teacher, I want you to do a couple of things. The first thing she said was, I want you to change the room. It was two little black girls, and we sat beside each other, and we talked the whole time. That's what we did. She said, we're going to change them, you're going to break them up. They're not going to sit beside each other. So you're going to alphabetize it, right? So they're not going to sit beside each other. The second thing she said to them was, when they raise their hand, you will call on them. When they don't, you won't. Because what the teacher was doing was calling on us when we didn't know the answer, which what? Eats at your self-esteem, and you just, you know. And the third thing she said is, you don't want me to come back up here no more. So I got what I got from my mama. Be real clear about that, right? So that changed. But what the message it sent to this woman is it was a young white woman. She never came back the next year. I don't think my mother had anything to do with it, but it was the changing of the schools in a way that the parents who showed up, and it was never all the parents, it didn't take but one or two, made it better for everybody else. That's a lesson in that. It's never going to be everybody.
That's right.
It doesn't take but one or two, but your presence is important. Fast forward, I eventually graduate. I go off to college. I have a BA in political science from Southern University in Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And as a political science student, I'm paying attention to politics, right? And I'm at Southern University, right? And if you were back in the day, if you were black and political scientist, you came through Southern University. The chairman of the department was a woman by the name of Jewel Prestige. Dr. Prestige was the first African-American woman to get a PhD in political science, right? So she was thorough, department thorough. And there is an African-American political scientist from Mississippi running for Congress. So we done talked about this in my class. And I figured out in my way of thinking, he can win. Because the way the district was configured, it was enough black folk, and if all black folk voted for him, and there were going to be some white folk who voted for him, he could win. So I didn't trust absentee ballots, because you had to get it notarized and signed and all of this stuff. I didn't trust they were going to count my vote, and I thought my vote was important. Amen. I got on the bus in Baton Rouge that morning, came to Vicksburg. My mother and her friends picked me up. We went and voted, had lunch. I got on the bus and went back to Baton Rouge that afternoon. I cast my vote for Dr. Leslie McLemore.
All right.
That's what that was about, right? Because I believed he was a really good-looking young man. Not that he's not a good-looking young man. He's a really good-looking young man, right?
I'm turning black now.
That he could win. And what I have said is a lesson we lost. He did not win. And we learned the wrong lesson. And that lesson has come back to haunt us in 2012. The lesson we learned was that we needed these supermajority districts in order to win. And so we began to carve out, both in terms of Congress, these supermajority districts, and state legislatures, these supermajority black districts. And right beside it, we carved out what has increasingly become these very conservative white districts. And there's no room and no space for moderates. When we talk about the landscape in the Deep South, where you have your population of African Americans are in the double digits, 20% and more, we find ourselves where we are now, except for Arkansas. All of these states, the House and the state legislatures, their House, their Senate, and their executive officer are Republicans. We did that. I think. Now, people, I ain't a political scientist. I ain't even no good lawyer, right? I'm good, whatever I am, right? But one of the things that happens when you have, how many of you voted in your last election back home for the House, right? You have people who are 18 who didn't vote. And there are lots of places where we were, there wasn't an election. I mean, there wasn't anybody running. There was no race, right? And where there is no race, there's no energy. Whereas there's no energy, people don't show up. And when people don't have a competitive race, what happens is they don't have to work and tell what they're doing, and we don't hold them accountable. And they get in the seats and act like they theirs and not the people's. And it's been like that for a long time. We did that. And now where we find ourselves are in a position where we don't, the redistricting has come and it's like, okay, really, we're going to keep it like that. We're going to keep you with, 75 and 80 majority black districts, and right next to you these white districts. And maybe if you made it 60, maybe if you made it 55. But there is this belief in our community that we cannot win unless we're a supermajority. Go back to Mrs. Hamer, looking back, looking forward. Remember I talked about the attributes, what she possessed, her courage, her intellect, she had this warrior spirit. All of that is the prism through which she saw the world. As someone who was empowered to do more, in spite of what was going on around her. I talked about myself, product of integration, mother who was like I was, did all the stuff that I've done. I see the world through those lenses. As somebody who I can walk both in the room with nobody but me and be fine.
That's right.
But that's how I see the world. The question is, how do you see the world? And what are you willing to do about how you see the world? Getting back to the president, right? And, I'm at the age, I wake up during the night, so I got a playbook. I wake up during the night, I take out my playbook and I read the news. That's a little tablet, that's my BlackBerry tablet. I'm reading the news and I'm reading these reports about the president. And I'm thinking, okay, so really, he didn't fight the way I would have wanted him to fight. But the person who would have fought the way I wanted him to fight wouldn't be president. Let's be real clear, right? So we have to think about the kinds of people that we're electing at all levels of leadership. Our city council, our supervisors, our mayors, our legislators, absolutely the school board, right? Are these people who are going to fight? Are they going to see the lens through which they view the world? Are they going to see it the way I need them to see it so they can move forward and get something done? Or, because there's a time to fight and there's a time to flee and there really is a time to work together. And the way to figure out how to work together is, what is your vision for the future? And that's a hard thing for people to articulate. People can tell you what they don't want, but it's hard to say what they do want, because when they start talking about what they do want, you can hold them accountable to that.
That's right.
All right. I asked earlier, who got Facebook, who got Twitter, he's telling me to wrap it up, so I'm going to wrap it up. The next generation, what your task is, your challenge, to use all that you have available to you to walk boldly in your calling, making that a career in such a way that it makes a difference. The young brother was talking about going to law school and leaving Mississippi. I'm a person who knew I was going to leave here because there was no place for me. I've gone for 25 years. I still, at least once a week, saying, why are you here? Because there's no place for me. But I think my presence makes a difference. Your presence will make a difference. I encourage young people to leave, but I also want you to come back.
All right.
I think there's something to going someplace where you don't know nobody and make your own way. Because particularly in this community, in this culture, you know who your mama is and where you grew up and that's real important. Being someplace where don't nobody know your mama is also, and making your way the right way is also real important. I think the challenge for this generation is to not just be sick and tired, right? But to decide that we are going to be extraordinary in all that we do. Right. And that skill that gift, that discipline is what's required. It means you hold yourself accountable and you can hold others accountable. I look forward to the questions. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Pam had mentioned earlier or something about lunch. I just drove down from Oxford, so I've had a chance to eat lunch. It's quite a task to follow Pam. I've known Pam for a number of years, and I would like to go before, not after. Let me thank Leslie and his staff for putting this event on, and also for keeping the memory and the good works of Fannie Lou Hamer alive. She referenced the event that took place in Oxford this week. I happened to have been there. And she mentioned the fact that James Meredith said this time, and he said the last time as well, that he was not going to take part in those events. Of course, his son, who, as you know, is a graduate of Ole Miss, was there and made some statements. James also said he would like to see that statue that you have out in front of Lyceum removed. And at some point, James may be successful in getting that done. She's absolutely right, though. You know, it should be about James. As James says, it's not about James, it's about God. And at this point, and how God leads him now to focus on education. Of course, I had the opportunity to work with Julia Alsabrook for many years when I was here at Brandeis. Here at Jackson State. And James is an interesting fellow. I respect and appreciate the work that he did, but he's sometimes very difficult to understand. Where have we come from in 50 years and examining the political environment through the eyes of Fannie Lou Hamer? Fannie Lou Hamer would probably cry tears of disappointment and see lost opportunities if she were to scan today's political environment. We have come a long ways in 50 years, and yet, in an ironic way, not too far. I need not share with you all the stats about the economics, the social, the health, the education, the housing, birth to unwed mothers, disproportionate incarceration of black males, and the quality of life and all those indicators, because you know about that. We've seen volumes written and spoken about these and other indicators in recent years. However, many of the official barriers were broken down because of the people like Fannie Lou Hamer and so many others who took Jim Crow on and defeated the institution during the defining American Civil Rights Movement. I believe, and I know William Wonder talks about this a great deal, I happen to believe also that the biggest psychological change to take place during the last 50 years has been the loss of fear, the absence of fear among African Americans. I can remember so vividly during the 60s when I personally witnessed the troops come through my hometown of Holly Springs on the way to Oxford to defend the right of James Meredith to attend the University of Mississippi. Just seeing the fear on the faces of so many people. What is this all about? This is a war zone here in America. And at a very young age, I saw firsthand that war zone. Interesting enough, we've had institutions like education, particularly K-12 and lunch counters and to eat where you want and to go and ride in the bus you want to ride on. All those barriers were broken down because of Mrs. Hamer and people like her. And then, of course, later on, we got jobs as professionals in the legal field, in the medical field, and they got a few jobs even in corporate America. And so many people, many black people thought that we had arrived, that during the 80s and 90s and 70s, things had pretty much got okay. But I think we need to remember, not only Fannie Lou Hamer, but I think we need to remember Frederick Douglass, who would say that without struggle, there is no freedom. At least no sustained and lasting freedom, justice, and equality. So it's important to always remember that we have to always struggle, that it's never over. On the downside, schools are now resegregated. I happen to work in Ashland, Mississippi, and I work very closely with the elementary school, the middle school, and the high school. And we have two districts up there. One Hickory Flat, and the other one in Ashland. And Ashland is about 99.9% black, and Hickory Flat is about 99.9% white. So you would think that after all those years and after all this activity, that the schools would be truly integrated, but we see just the opposite. And I would imagine Jackson, Mississippi is not much different. If you look at poverty rates, for an example, it looks like the 60s in many ways, notwithstanding the government safety net. And the economic wealth of black people in this country and in Mississippi have declined, not increased. As I said, I mentor at the middle school and the elementary school there in Ashland. I had the opportunity to attend graduation this past year. There were 65, it's a small district, there were 65 students who graduated from that district. And of that 65, there were 5 black males. Houston, we have a problem. Mrs. Helmer would be pleased to know, and Pam mentioned that earlier, that Barack Obama was elected president. My mother, who lived 95 and passed away this spring, was pleased to see that. B. Branch and I was talking about that the other day, that her mother, who lived to be 90 plus, was also pleased to see. But I think that she would shed tears at this point about our collective state of non-involvement at the local level. She would be appalled at how we as Mississippians and Americans have allowed the oligarchy to take away our desire and ability to struggle. And that's our issue. We can talk about the debate all we want to. We can talk about the presidency all we want to. But at the end of the day, what are we doing? What do we do? These people are not likely to save us. In other words, we have collectively abdicated our responsibility as citizens and given over those powers to elected officials, lobbyists, and the very wealthy that control the sources of economic power and political power. Really, nothing has changed, right? And that includes local elected officials. Mrs. Hamer and the progressive and courageous people of the 50s, 60s, and 70s forced the action. They did not wait on Washington or Jackson to save us. That was this strong internal and historical sense that people had to save themselves with help from forces who believed in justice and democracy also. Even at the young age of 14 and working with other young people in SNCC, I knew if change were to occur, somehow collectively we had to make it happen. We did not know what the outcome would be, but we knew that the status quo of Jim Crow was not acceptable. The political environment that exists today is reactive. This has been true during a number of election cycles. I hear people say all the time, my vote won't count. Why get involved? It's not going to make a difference anyway. Somehow, many poor people have collectively bought into the notion that people do not have any power in this American republic. Many of them believe that they're like sheep being led to the slaughter. There's this kind of Jim Crowism that is more subtle and more insidious. We have an education apparatus, not only in Mississippi, but throughout the country, that are leaving our poor children unprepared for the world of work and productivity, but custom made to send many of our young people here in Mississippi, particularly black male, to the penitentiary and parchment. The need to fundamentally change the way the system delivers education in Mississippi should be the next civil rights movement, notwithstanding the comments that were made by Condoleezza Rice at the convention, the Republican convention in Miami, or wherever it was, Tampa. You have a Republican now talking about civil rights, education being the civil rights. Mrs. Hamer and others 50 years ago knew very well that elected officials and government do not make change, people do. This is true here in Mississippi and other places in the world where people have lost patience with the tyranny of, be it political, social, economic, or religious. Mrs. Hamer refused to accept the tyranny of the plantation because she worked on that plantation. She refused to accept the tyranny of that plantation. She would want people of Mississippi today to refuse to accept the tyranny of complacency and perceived powerlessness, and organize and mobilize to change the objective conditions of their lives. We have a successful model, and that model is the modern civil rights movement. Mrs. Hamer and people who engaged in the civil rights movement elected people, and they expected people to respond positively because they kept the pressure on. We see movements all across this world, in Egypt, and the American South, in India, in South Africa, the Vietnam movement, and the women movement. And what we saw there was the grassroots, taking control of their lives and doing things for themselves. Regarding Mississippi, oftentimes we say with pride, we have the largest number of elected officials of any state in the union. And Ms. Hamer would be proud of that. I'm proud of that. But what difference has that made in the lives of the average person? I had the opportunity to, as Pam spend a lot of time in the legislature. And so as you know, in Mississippi, we have a House and the Senate, and we have two powerful committees, Appropriations and Finance. And Percy Watson, in Ways and Means, who was fortunate enough to be the head of Ways and Means for a number of years, and one of the things Percy would say to me, and I had a chance to witness this personally, he couldn't get his caucus to even attend meetings after time. And a few years later, look at what happened. There's been a complete change in the legislature. It's now controlled by Republican and right-wing Tea Party types. There's not one black person in the state of Mississippi now controlling a money committee. We had that and gave it away. Now, what does that say about accountability? Well, it says at the local level, once you elect these folks, you have to put the pressure on, and you have to keep them, as you point out, accountable. Because if you do not, then where are we? The political scene in Mississippi may be experiencing a back to the future moment. Reconstruction in its aftermath. When the right-wing, reactionary, racist, Democrat, districrat took over after Reconstruction, they kept that power for 80 years. But how do we know that that's not going to happen again? Given the scenario, it's quite likely. We now have not the Dixiecrat in power, we have something called the Republicans in power. But who controls those Republicans that's now in power? Regarding non-elected status, because I think this idea was to look at not only the political scene, but also the non-political scene. Not much to show, in my view, collectively. A few influential ministers around the Jackson area, a few professionals here and there, some nonprofit making some noise. But for the most part, there's no clear leadership, there's no clear direction for the majority of Mississippi of color. Because of this gap, many of the young people of color appear to be adrift. Some would argue that we don't need one leader, that the black community is too diverse, too sophisticated for a one leader type concept. Perhaps that argument has some validity. A counter argument may be, what has the lack of leadership delivered to significantly change the objective conditions in Mississippi compared to other states in the union? So, okay, on one hand, you argue that we're diverse and we're very sophisticated. We don't need just one leader or two leaders or whatever. But whatever we got as a counter argument. It seems to me that the way to train young people is by example. Many of the old heroes, like Mrs. Hamer and so many others, have passed on. And we have, I think, a gap. And of course, who is filling that gap in a sustained way? Again, we hear this saying, I do not have the time, but someone else will do it. I do not have a silver bullet. However, I do think that I do share Mrs. Hamer's philosophy in this regard, and that is the home, the school, young people themselves, with the use of technology, can regain much of that power that has been abdicated to the wealthy and oligarchic few. They have to understand, though, that in a democratic republic, the people are the ultimate source of power. And it's not going to happen unless they make it happen. Of course, by peaceful means. That means good and effective organization at every level, which are sustained over generations. This cannot be happened. It cannot last for 5 years or 10 years or 30 years. It has to be over generations. And it has to be sustained. Otherwise, you have to start all over again. Election, as Pam pointed out, is coming this November. We want you to get out and vote. But please understand that politicians can and will be affected only if you make them accountable. If people are not organized, if they're not engaged, if they're not aware of the issues, then what do we expect to get? The same thing we've always got. and that is the status quo. So, again, she ended on Mrs. Hamer's point about I'm tired or being sick and tired. But the only way to change that is to organize on a collective, in a collective way at the local level. You have to be involved. We cannot wait on other people to save us from us. Thank you.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So quiet in here. I don't know if y'all trying to fall asleep because of a good lunch or you're bored to death or what's going on. Everybody okay?
Yes.
All right. Well, I'm about to bore you to death, okay? So anytime you, for me, when you talk about where have we come in 50 years, have to look at what's the measurement? What are we measuring against? And if it was Ms. Hamer, her measurement would be the 50 years prior to 1962. Because prior to 1962 was the reality in which she grew up. It was the catalyst that created the energy behind her activity. It was the reality that the community she came from were not viewed as human. It was the reality that that view of the community she came from not being human created conditions in which she thought was not something that God would like any of his children to live in. And as a result of that, she joined a very small group of individuals. So oftentimes when we talk about the civil rights movement, we think it's this large movement of the people who went to the March on Washington. In reality, it was just a few people, most of the time, in some communities. And Ms. Hamer was one of those few people in one of those few communities. And what's unique about the civil rights movement as we glorify it today, we give attributes to individuals who were not even part of the civil rights movement. And we diminish the very individuals who were the biggest catalysts. During the challenge of 1964 was a unique event. And this is some of a recount from John Ditmer's book, Local People, and listening to the stories of individuals who were there, like Hollis Watkins and MacArthur Carter and others. Young people, students, they decided to take on a cause. And through that cause, and a few older people. See, Ms. Hamer was one of the few older people, and I don't think she was in her 30s at this time. Most of the folks who were pushing were young people, 18 to 21. Now, you did have an infrastructure of individuals, men who had gone to World War II and came back and began to work, and they built an infrastructure. And many of those individuals, such as Medgar Evers and Aaron Henry and Amzie Moore and C.C. Bryant and Vernon Damer and Harper and Turnbow and all these folks, they created an infrastructure. And in an infrastructure, they began to push back because they had fought for a war for freedoms that they couldn't enjoy at home. And many of them operated under Dr. Howard, who was a physician in Mount Bayou. And if you notice, it is this ongoing legacy of a generational fight. That 50 years prior to Fannie Hamer in 1912, we were under a code of segregation. 50 years prior to that, we were not even citizens. And so she only continued a struggle that as young people in Jackson State, we are charged to continue, because the question is, what would it look like 50 years from now? And so as those individuals who went to World War II and came back and created an infrastructure for the fight, young students recognized that the very things they were studying in school, in terms of this thing called the Constitution and the Bill of Rights, were not being properly applied to them as individuals. Because to live under a Constitution, and yet that Constitution don't speak to your rights as a citizen, I mean, that's something off kilter. And if it's something off kilter, who's going to speak? Who's going to agitate? Who's going to raise the question? And many of those students had no idea what they were getting into. Now, a lot of them will talk about, yeah, we had this thing down pat, and y'all not doing like we're doing, you should do this, but truth be told, many of them took on a cause. They had no idea where it was going to lead them. They had no idea how to define freedom. They were singing freedom songs. If you ask 5 of them, how did you define freedom? One of them said, I just want a good government job. Another one said, I want to go back to Africa, and another one may say, I want to create a Republic of New Africa here in America. It all depends who you ask. But they did something. They got engaged. They realized the wrongness of the society they lived in, and they decided that it was cool to do something about it. The question for the students here, what are you going to do so when we look back 50 years from now, what will be the mark? Eugene Robinson, who's a columnist for Washington Post, wrote a book called Disintegration. Interesting book. He talks about, after integration, the dividing up of Africans and Americans. And he put us all in 4 buckets. First buckets are the mainstream, those of us who've had the advantage to go to school, good, decent jobs, and move into what is defined as the middle class. He talked about those who are transcendent, those who have done exceptionally well. President Obama, Oprah Winfrey, Bill Cosby, Jay-Z. Only a few people get into that category. He talked about the immigrant and the emerging class, those Africans and Caribbeans who come to America, many of whom, they are the most educated immigrant group that come to this country. Africans and Caribbean, they have more education than any other immigrant who migrated to this country. Understand, immigration, in order to immigrate from your country, oftentimes you're at the top of that country because you have the means and you have intellectual ability to navigate through the process to get here. All right. And then he talked about this other group called the left behind, the abandoned. And if you're like me, you come from that group called the abandoned, those who may not have gone to college. They live in the neighborhoods that our parents grew up in or where I grew up in. And oftentimes those who are in the mainstream, those who are in the immigrant class, and those who are transcendent, they fly over the community. They drive past it or they drive around it. In fact, if you see this if you would have seen this neighborhood 20 years from now, this was an abandoned neighborhood. Where this building sit was a bunch of row houses, prostitutes, crackheads, and everything else you want to buy on the street. Because Jackson State ended at Dalton Street. And you go down, it was something special, wasn't it? Yeah. For those who know. Those are the individuals who are the abandoned. And the question that I think Ms. Hamer will be asking now, who's going to speak for the abandoned? Because many folks who are made it to the mainstream, they talk about economic conditions as it impact them, but they don't talk about economic conditions as it lifts up all of us. All right. They talk about the young men hanging on the corner with the baggy pants as if they are pariah, as opposed to talk about how to get the young men from the corner so they can be better. We talk about the young ladies with the dresses and how they dress who live in abandoned communities, and we don't talk about how to transition them out of abandoned communities. And the uniqueness thing about what has happened over the last 50 years in Mississippi, we have advanced faster than any state in the Union in the African American community. Politically. And nobody gave it to us. It was only through fighting at the ballot box, in the courtroom, strategically and collectively. I tell anybody in this country, Mississippi is the most fertile state for African Americans than any other state in the country. And we don't see that because we live here, and there is something special about critical thinking skills that's no longer taught in school. We only see what's in front of us, and we don't have the vision to see what the possibilities could be. Now, when you go to the definition of vision, you get the first definition, it is what you see with your eyes. But it's that second definition that Fannie Lou Hamer and others like her saw. They didn't see what was in front of them. They seen the possibilities of what could be. And the uniqueness about our young folk, you all have more than any group of young folks who've come before you. But the second definition of vision is what's lacking. You don't see what the possibilities could be. And in that, we will be at a crossing point. I don't think we're there yet. I'm an optimist. I see opportunities bubbling everywhere. But we're at a crossing point because if it's not enough of us and enough communities seeing what the opportunity could be, we're going to lose it. And we are losing it faster than necessary. See, the struggles around education is not divorced from the struggles of Ms. Hamer. It is a direct connection between Brown versus Board of Education. Make no about it. Brown was decided in 54. Brown 2 was decided in 55. And the Supreme Court came out in 55 with this decision called all deliberate speed. Do anyone understand how to define all deliberate speed? I'm going to define it for you. It's taking X-Lax with a sleeping pill. It's kind of a bad place to be, right? You either lay there in a bunch of mess or you sit on a stool, fall asleep. Either one. But the state of Mississippi and its policymakers created a process not to integrate schools. And integrating schools had nothing to do with who sits next to you in the school. It is the mechanism on which young people will be provided with the necessary exposures to develop critical thinking skills to run government, run businesses, and be productive, and which young people will be provided with the programming to work for others and be subjected to government whims. It's a difference. And without having vision and or critical thinking skills, we find ourselves looking at the reality of all of our successes in ways in which we don't see the opportunities that it present us. So the question is for Fannie Lou Hamer. I think she was more of a visionary with critical thinking skills than not. Denver recounts the challenge of 64, and he talks about how with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, who organized across the state something that didn't exist because they had vision, there was a Democratic Party that upheld the principles and the policies of the party and organized individuals county by county, precinct by precinct, and then go to challenge the fallacy of the Democratic Party as it exists. That's vision. That's critical thinking skills. And when they got there, they recognized they was going to be on the world stage because everybody was looking. And on that world stage, that they could make a point that could not be made by simply being here in Mississippi. They could make it because all of the world was watching, especially this superpower called the Soviet Union. Strategic. And in that, they recognized it will force the president's hand to make a decision. You're going to have to abide by your own rules, or you're going to have to side with a group of folks that's breaking your rules. And in that, Others tried to give a compromise. And the compromise was, we will seat all the regular Democrats and we'll give 2 seats to the Mississippi Freedom Democrats. And I think this is the point at where we are in this community. The decision was split. Half, a little bit less than half of the group, according to others who reported this, wanted to take the deal. Ms. Hamers and others didn't want to take the deal. And the difference between those who want to take the deal and didn't want to take the deal were those who had education want to take the deal. And those who had a core moral value of what was right and what was wrong and was willing to fight for the long-term improvement, say, we didn't come here to fit in 2 seats. And Ms. Hamer's quote, and I'm paraphrasing, was that it seems as if the more education we get, the worse we become. For the students at Jackson State, allow education to be the tool to develop your critical thinking skills, so that you can have a vision to see what should be and what could be and not talk about what is, so that you can understand that vision of what could be part of your work, as opposed to you just getting discouraged and settle for something you should not settle for. Education is a tool to develop, nurture, and strengthen your critical thinking skills. It is not something to mute and dull your ability so you take deals and accept stuff that you should not accept. If Fannie Lou Hamer was here today and looked back, I think she would be disappointed. Disappointed because where we could be, we're not, but excited that we are much farther than where we were. Thank you.
Well, this has been absolutely good. We have a good 15 minutes here for questions and answers, and any comments. If you have comments, please make them short, please, to any of the panelists, all the panelists. I'll be more than happy to acknowledge you and give you the mic that you up at the top. Can you talk loud enough for us to hear you? If not, I'll come up there.
Yeah, bring the mic.
Thank you. First and foremost, if you have a Facebook account, I want you to go to RBG Events. Once again, if you have a Facebook account, go to RBG Events. I'll give the answer first and ask the question second. The answer is Amos Wilson, Blueprint for Black Power. The answer is Chancellor Williams, the Raven, our second agreement with death. Those are the answers. The questions are, first I want to give credit to Ms. Shaw. You asked about what type of leader today, elected at all levels do we have, and why was Fannie Lou so empowered towards fearlessness as contrasted to today's leadership. Mr. DeBerry, you answered collective organization is the answer over sustained periods of time. And Darrell Johnson, you gave a whole bunch of answers to these questions and asking what is the rubric by which success is measured, and that Fannie Lou Hamer would have measured 50 years back for 50 years forward. Now, anybody who begins their history with enslavement, everything else seems like progress.
That's right.
So my question is, if money is the mother's milk of politics, how can black people realistically expect accountable or loyal politicians without viable, self-sufficient communities? What institutions in the black community have and are producing or have produced an economic agenda that is practical and pragmatic for black people? And why is black leadership afraid of the black nationalism as expressed by Malcolm X in Ballot or the Book?
All right. So you have 3 questions. We have 3 panelists that can take the questions.
I'll just, am I on?
Yeah.
Thanks for the comment. In terms of institutions, historically, you've had the black church, which was an independently owned institution. You've had black colleges that was black owned for a number of generations, particularly in Mississippi. Those institutions are very viable for a long period of time. Now, with respect to politics, I agree that, again, you need to have organization at the local level. It needs to be sustained over time. Now, the question is, how do you get resources? Again, black folk do have resources. The question is how you use those resources. Do they have as many resources as Mitt Romney? No. But the resources that you have, if they are targeted correctly and used correctly over time, can make a difference. With respect to nationalism and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, for example, I think if you look at their philosophy, they had more in common than they had differences. The same thing with, say, W.E.B. Du Bois in Washington, that they had more in common than they have differences. Oftentimes, though, the talking heads out there and other folks, for whatever reason, like to always point out the differences as opposed to the similarities of the two.
So, you know, a stereotype of what is a value system in our community, what we hear is that people think their vote doesn't count, and so they don't engage in the process. And what I've been saying lately is, if your vote didn't count, why would they be working so hard to keep you from voting?
That's right. Say it again.
I don't think money trumps people, right? So if my family, the way I view the world, if I view the world that people are more important and they're as powerful as money, and people is what I got, and we got people. We got to engage our people in the process. Upcoming election, I have this little, everywhere I'm going, I've been saying take two. Everybody who goes to the poll, take two people with you. If we increased voter participation, I'm not talking about voter registration. If we increased voter participation by 10%, we'd have a whole different landscape. Money can't trump that. I don't give my power away like that.
That's right.
All I got is me. I ain't got no money. Right? But I do have me. I have my power and I have my influence. You've never had in this country, and you'll never have everybody moving in the same direction. That's okay. Right? Get out my way. Because this is where we're going. The challenge is most of us don't have a direction that we're going in. I go back to, you know, we know what we don't want, but we don't know what we do want. When you articulate for yourself, even in your personal life, what it is that you want, you can get that thing. In the Bible it says, and I'm not trying to quote no scripture, so don't say she up there quoting scripture, where there is no vision, the people perish. We got what we have because this is what we were looking for. We got one thing and didn't go forward. Derek is absolutely right. We have to have vision, and we got to be fearless and courageous as we move forward. And we have the power. We have the people. We may not have the money. And again, if it wasn't important, if voting wasn't important, do you think they'd be working so hard to keep people from voting? No. If it was just, you know, really, they're not going to show up, so we don't. Voter ID, voter suppression, really? That tells you, out of just being rebellious, I'm going to show up and take somebody. Just because they don't want me there.
That's right.
That's how I am.
Just real quick, I do believe money trump people when people are not organized. Organized people trump money every time. The problem I've seen is the fact that African American community, like no community, we're not a monolith. And unless we figure out what is the standard connector, and I mentioned the book Disintegration, and his greater point was, because we are working in different focuses, we are breaking up as a nucleus, as a community. And that's a true reality. I think the challenge for us is to figure out what is that common denominator that pulls us back together around that something. And economic development, for many, has been, I didn't get my contract or I didn't get my opportunity. But how do we develop that common denominator? Naomi McBarr used to call it that collective consciousness. And that's what's lacking, and that's something that we all have a responsibility to try to pull back together. Not ceding the power to so-called leaders, because I don't believe in leaders, I believe in plural leaders.
Right.
that we all have an equal responsibility based on our capacity to add value to that collective consciousness so that we can be an organized people that trump money when money is arrayed against us.
Okay, other questions or comments? Anybody? Yes.
I just wanted to know what book you were quoting from local people.
It's called, it's Local People, The Civil Rights Struggle of Local People in Mississippi. The author is John Dittmer.
John
D-I-T-M-E-R. Dittmer.
Johnson.
Quickly, someone mentioned that one of the institutions that we've had in Mississippi, or in the black community, has been the black church. At my church, we've been talking about a recent statistic that was published that there are over 800 churches in the Jackson metro area. Where is the conscious raising capacity of 800 churches to kind of rally around some of these issues to try to, sustain and organize the community to act in its own self-interest? Is there some kind of ethos? Now, even in the civil rights movement, I understand that there wasn't a critical mass of black churches. There were very few black churches that actually stepped up and did a whole lot. But I'm looking for the very few, at some level.
That's right.
What could we do to try to spark that kind of institutional momentum and motivation to actually act in the best interest of many of the people that are coming and showing up every Sunday, giving their last penances to support that institution? Where can we hold them accountable to do more in the community, on an organized basis?
Johnson, I mentioned the issue about the black churches because of the question related to political independence and economic independence.
Yeah.
With respect to your question, which is a good one, you're absolutely right. There was a lot of diversity among churches, even during the civil rights movement. There were clearly churches and pastors of those churches who were involved, and there was many churches, for whatever reason, sometimes fear, who were not involved. As it relates to today, though, you just mentioned Jackson. Well, look at the whole state and get a number. I'm sure it's going to be fairly large. You can go to any small town in Benton County, for example, with a population of 8,000 people, they probably got 6,000 churches. I may exaggerate a little bit there, but in terms of the focus, in terms of where ministers want to go, I don't know, because again, there's a great deal of diversity, a great deal of confusion, and I don't want to be too, you have political pimps in the church like you do in the workplace else. So if you don't have engaged ministers with the vision that the previous speakers talked about, then you have that gap. I mean, you got the capacity, but you have to have that willingness on the part of those pastors to move. But you also have to have members within that church who are willing to take on certain things like we putting $100,000 into the bank every week. How can we redirect some of those funds in a way that we can do something about the education system, that we do something about economic development? There are a lot of things that they can do, but the people themselves, just like in the community, got to be engaged in such a way that they have to put pressures on those ministers to make those ministers accountable. If not, then they're not going to be accountable.
I would simply say there are a lot of churches doing stuff that most don't know about, and we write them off too fast. There are a lot of churches who could and should do more, and they're not. The church reflects not the pastor all the time, but it's the congregants. And if we don't have a collective consciousness outside of the church wall, we're not going to walk in church and develop one. Right. But with that said, if it's 800 churches in Jackson, that looks like an opportunity to me. That looks like an opportunity for us that if that's going to be the convener of the masses, then we need to figure out how do we leverage that convener to get messages out towards a progressive agenda.
Are there any other questions or comments? I'm sorry.
I think we are at a really peculiar time in history, in that historic institutions won't have the relevance that they will in the future. And I think we need to acknowledge that, right? I don't know about Mississippi, but across the country, you have fewer people in church now than you've ever had. There's this huge body of folk who the institution that we know of as the church is not working for them for a whole host of reasons. And where you do have the churches, you have the mega churches, and so they have a different kind of role in community than the historic community churches have had. I think our challenge is given, and I think this is, I think as Dr. DeBerry said, it's like it was right after this post-Reconstruction. I mean, we are at that kind of risk, particularly in the Deep South. Right? And some of it we're complicit in. Right? Our schools are bad in communities where you got black principals, black superintendents, black school board members, black mads, you understand what I'm saying? Some of that we can do some stuff about without any help. The challenge for the young people is, again, how do you use these tools that you have to advance a different agenda, and what is that for you? If the few folk who heard about it, were part of, and showed up at meetings around civil rights, they ain't had no telephone. They ain't had no Facebook, they ain't had no Twitter. But they talked and they shared and they moved in concert. Derek has mentioned several times the book Disintegration, and one of the points Eugene Robinson made was everybody prior to Brown and prior to the civil rights movement was arrayed against racism. That was the enemy. And increasingly in our community, it's not racism, it's classism. It's all of these other isms that have come into play that has divided us. I contend when you talk to people about their children, that's the great equalizer. Everybody wants what's best for their children. And when we say, okay, this is an agenda and we're going to move forward and build this agenda around the children, we can create all kinds of bridges that we haven't been able to.
Okay, there's a question up top. Yes.
I have a question.
Comment.
I have a comment. I want to piggyback on something Ms. Shaw just said. To the young people, the tools that you have available today and your fingertips is power. This right here has been used all over the world to change people's way of life. We need to start looking at using this as a collective effort to change our ways of life. Right here in Mississippi, communication instant. I'm on Facebook, George Felton Barrow. Just look it up, I'm there. I make statements. It's all about community, people working together. I listen to worldly TV, Democracy Now!, Free Speech TV. Gives you a whole different perspective of what's happening. Because if you don't know what's going on in the world, you really can't gauge yourself as how you operate here in the world. But I want to tell you, your desktop computers, PCs, iPads, iPhones, these things can be powerful tools. Not only just for communication, but economics. This is where the money is going to be made. In electronic, in the new information age. We got to get with that, young people, and you got to come together and say, decide what your future is going to look like. That's what Fannie Lou Hamer and them did. They said, well, we don't want this the way it is today. We want to see a different world. And so they had to go out and go door to door, walk miles and miles, wear out pairs of shoes, get spit on and beat up, all that kind of stuff. You don't have to do that. You can sit at home. You can sit right here in this auditorium and you can form a group of people, thousands of people, within a matter of minutes with this right here. You have to make a decision, like they say, where are you going to fit in the new world? How, when you look back 50 years from now, to see where you come from, to see where you are going to be, or where you have transformed to. So use this, young people. You have to be the ones who make the transformation. Economics is the new frontier that, as black people particularly, have to conquer. Concentrate on the information that you have available to you and the power that you have available to you in the information age, and use it to transform this country for your betterment and for your children. All you all gonna have some children one day. You want them to have a better world than you're in, I'm sure. So it's up to you. It's your choice, and it can be done. So don't feel that you have nothing to contribute. Everyone has something to contribute to society, to the betterment of society. So don't ever think, sir, oh, I'm just nobody. Yes, you are. You are somebody. You are a powerful person. You just don't realize it yet.
Thank you very much.
One
One more question. Go ahead.
Yes.
Yes.
This is for Attorney Shaw.
Yes.
Your statement that everyone wants what's best for their children, I would like to know what you think, how does that relate to what we see in parents not taking an interest in their children's education by not going to parent-teacher conferences?
Say it again.
So you missed my earlier comment.
Yes, I did. I apologize.
No. This was before my session. I was telling a story about a conversation I had with a 23-year-old young woman on Tuesday at the hospital, right? And I'm talking to her 4-year-old daughter, and I said to her, the little girl, where do you go to school? And, she's hemming and hawing, and her mother said, well, she just started Monday. It's Tuesday. And I said, sweetheart, we 8 weeks into the school. You don't do that. First day of school, start your baby to school. It's important. I went on and talked about some other things. This 23-year-old is my niece's friend, right? And my niece said to me later, she's never met a woman like you. Well, okay. She said, no, because you told her something. You said to her, start your baby at school the first day. Doesn't matter what is going on in your life, get your life together, make sure your baby go to school. Nobody had ever said that to her. You have lots of folks who don't know. And part of what has happened in our community, there was a time when the older woman, there is a black woman evangelist named Claudette Copeland out of San Antonio, Texas. And she said there was a time in our community, the older women would say, baby, there's a cliff down that road. Make sure you know where you're going. There's a cliff down that road. We don't have that in our communities anymore. We don't share the little wisdom. And so one of the things, and this is particularly as our community, as Eugene Robinson talks about, has disintegrated, the only people who talk to are people you talk to who don't know nothing. If they don't know nothing, then they talking to you, and you don't know nothing. You ain't gonna know nothing. We don't share the wisdom. So I think part of our challenge is, and particularly those of us who are mature women, is to share the wisdom in love. So I can say, sweetheart, your baby needs to show up at school every day, right? And I didn't know it was a big deal, but it was to her. I can have the same kind of conversation with the woman who works at the grocery store, and I do, who works at the drive. Your kids started school. I mean, the kinds of things that we take, they want what's best, but they don't know what's best. This concept of parents showing up for stuff, as important as it is, there was always a time it wasn't all the parents. It wasn't, because there were parents who worked, who were tired, and we started penalizing poverty. We asked poor parents to do stuff that we never asked middle class and upper middle class parents to do. Right? But when I can do it, and I can help them do it, that's what community is. It's helping folk to do it, and because we become so segregated by class, by what is important, by, that we don't do that anymore. I think everybody, I in another life, I worked as an attorney for somebody who represented a man who actually was killed. He was on death row, right? This is the brother who killed a whole bunch of folks. His mother said he was the best child. I've never met a parent who said, I'm raising a serial killer. They think their children, and they want what's best for their children. Now, what they may know to be what's best may not be. That's why the community is so important.
Okay. Unfortunately, time has it. This has been absolutely good. Time has it. We in fact, are 5 minutes over. I'll forego my couple comments. Dr. McLemore, let us give the panelists a hand. Thank you all very much.
Thank you, panel members and everybody. Just a couple of quick comments. We have another session starting at 2:30, so don't leave. Just stay here. And I want to acknowledge the fact that we also have, and we've had this morning, a lot of individuals from the community. So let me thank all of you who are here. And since I'm director of the Hamer Institute, let me just be a bit factual here. My good friend, attorney Darrell Johnson, pointed out Fannie Lou Hamer was actually 44 when she was evicted from the plantation. She was actually 46 when she gave the testimony at the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, New Jersey. And I'm not personalizing this, but I was a member of the delegation. And I was the second youngest person in the delegation. In 1964, I was 23 years old. And there was a guy by the name of Dr. Williams, who's Dr. William Scott now, who was a student with me at Russ College. He was 22. So none of us in the delegation, and he wasn't necessarily talking about the delegation, but I just want to say, just for the record, William Scott was the youngest person in the delegation. He was 22. So there were no 18-year-old people. And the folk that he referenced are actually great and outstanding civil rights people, but they were not a member of the delegation in 1964. And so I just want the young people, the students who are still here, and then let me give you another book, because some community people, it's important to get a good reading of this Mississippi civil rights history, and another companion book along with John Ditmer's book that is called Local People. Another good book is by a guy named Charles Payne called I've Got the Light of Freedom, that gives an outstanding history of the civil rights movement in Mississippi, and especially the Mississippi Delta. So if you really want to read about this history and get it right, it's important, you know, to just look at these things. And that's what we've been trying to do for the last 15 years in the name of Fannie Lou Hamer. Amen. And you can see the lecture series started 29 years ago when I was chair of the political science department. And we actually started it before, but we started it on an annual basis 29 years ago. So we're going to celebrate 30 years next year. And it's going to be led by this young lady right here, Dr. Daphne Chamberlain, who has a PhD in history from the University of Mississippi and is a Tougaloo College graduate. And we're so proud of her. Okay.
Dr. Leslie, I want to point out, he's absolutely right about the delegate, but I was there as a young person, but I was not as a delegate.
That's
but
right.
I did was there on the boardwalk, and I did have a chance to hear what she said.
How old were you?
I was about 14.
Yeah.
I was a youngster.
Yeah,
but he was right. I was not a delegate. I was there as a participant.
Now, please don't leave, because we have an exciting panel coming up on education, and all the panel members are here and they're ready to go. So in 5 minutes, they're going to kick off. Let's give the panel members another round of applause.
Johnson. Hey, man. How you doing, brother?
Oh, wonderful. Fantastic.
And those principles have not changed.
Hey, Johnson. Now, are you Are you? Oh, okay. Yeah, that's good. That's good. That sounds like real room. That's good. That's a good idea.
Hey, Noel.
Yes, sir. JSU-MS. That's what you Right. Yeah, that's right. Keep it back.
There's a gate or something happening.
Oh, okay. I hadn't seen that. Check it out.